Good. Thank you. I fear I rather rushed in where angels fear to tread when I proposed many months ago to give this talk. I'm not a hardcore philosopher, and certainly in the case of Langer, I'm very much a novice, just starting out on my quest to trace possible links between her work and Murdoch's. Both philosophers were also extremely complex, subtle thinkers, which makes it hard to tease out what each of them was saying, and harder still to compare their ideas. So my talk today will be largely exploratory. I imagine you're all reasonably familiar with Murdoch, but I'm not sure how much you know of Susanne Langer. So I'll begin with a brief introduction just to situate her within the history of 20th century philosophy, and we'll then go on to describe her thought in a bit more detail and suggest some possible links with Murdoch. Born in New York in 1895, Langer was an American philosopher of German extraction. Both her parents were German immigrants, and she grew up in a German-speaking household. She studied and then taught philosophy for many years at Radcliffe College, before moving on in the 1940s to take up teaching posts first at Columbia, then later at Connecticut College and several other prestigious institutions. She died in 1985. Today, she's best known for her theories on art, but her ideas on the nature of mind and language are also beginning to receive more attention now, particularly in the States. She wrote extensively on all these topics, her most famous works being Philosophy in a New Key, published in 1942, Feeling and Form, published in 1953, the vast three-volume work, Mind, an Essay on Human Feeling, published between 1967 and 1982. Like Murdoch, perhaps like all philosophers, her thinking on specific objects of inquiry was informed by an overarching idea that runs through all her work and makes it difficult to treat any one topic in isolation. In Langer's case, this overarching idea had to do with what she saw as the fundamentally abstractive, symbolizing nature of mind. Her thinking was shaped most obviously by Ernst Cassirer, whom she met in America, and his conception of human beings as animal symbolicum, by Alfred North Whitehead, her doctoral supervisor, and his ideas on the biological basis of mind, by Henry Scheffer, her undergraduate tutor, and his understanding of logic not as deduction or induction, but the study of patterns and forms. And significantly by Wittgenstein, whom she met in Vienna in 1922, and whose Tractatus she read, most probably in the original German. She's interesting, I think, as somebody who is able linguistically, conceptually, and methodologically to bridge the divide between analytic and continental philosophy, and to draw on a vast range of thinkers from many different fields and intellectual traditions. A particular interest for me is the way that her knowledge of German allowed her to play with certain distinctions that may be less obvious or less readily explicable in English. Distinctions, for example, between different kinds of picture or different kinds of meaning, or between a concept and a conception. In May 1951, Murdoch acquired a copy of Langer's hugely successful book, Philosophy in a New Key, already appearing in its second edition in the States. Murdoch's copy, now held in the archive at Kingston University, contains extensive underlinings and annotations made in Murdoch's own hand, together with a series of notes she scribbled on the back 2 pages. An inscription on the inside cover suggests she obtained her copy in London, but other than that, I have no indication of how or why she acquired it. Perhaps she'd read a recent review of the book. It had been reviewed in Mind in 1945, but a further, equally enthusiastic review appeared in the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science in May 1951. Or perhaps she attended Dorothy Emmett's lecture to the Aristotelian Society in May 1951, in which Philosophy in a New Key was mentioned. Or perhaps she was just intrigued by the book's arresting title. Either way, her many notes and underlinings, plus the fact that years later she lent her copy to her doctoral student Rachel Fenner when Fenner was preparing a dissertation on the imagination as a moral tool, suggest Langer's book made a significant and lasting impact on her. I believe it played a part in helping to stimulate her ideas, both positively and as a foil in some respects for her own emerging position, at a time when she was preparing her early papers on the nature of mind, and at a time too when she was working on her long-awaited study of existentialism. I should stress that I'm not claiming Murdoch's philosophy was the same as, or even especially similar to Langer's. Simply that Langer's book may have helped, at a crucial stage in her development, to stimulate her ideas, and importantly, to suggest distinctions and nuances that allowed her to begin to formulate her own position more precisely. As far as I know, she never cited Langer, nor to my knowledge did the two of them have any direct contact. But Langer does seem to have occupied a place in Murdoch's conceptual hinterland, not least by offering a more promising lens through which to interpret Wittgenstein. I'll attempt now very briefly to summarize Langer's basic arguments in Philosophy and a New Key, before looking in more detail at those parts of the book that seem to interest Murdoch the most. The starting point for Langer, the new key that she perceived as having been struck in philosophy over the previous 2 or 3 decades, was the idea that human beings are essentially symbol-making and symbol-using creatures. They have the ability and uniquely the need, according to Langer and Cassirer, to transform their experiences into symbolic form, to formulate them, so they can think and talk about them. When we conceive of something, we have to do so in some form, she argued. We have to be able to see it in our mind's eye. The human mind is not merely a transmitter that receives, stores, and transmits sense data to our various motor centers, primed for action. It is also a transformer of that data. Quote, "For the brain is not merely a great transmitter, a super switchboard. It's better likened to a great transformer. The current of experience that passes through it undergoes a change of character by virtue of a primary use which is made of it immediately. It is sucked into the stream of symbols that constitutes a human mind." End quote. In recent years, we've become so used to this picture of the human mind as a constructive, meaning-making faculty, a great transformer, and so accepting of it as a picture not just of the nature of mind, but of reality itself as a metaphysical picture, that it's hard to pin down exactly what these early philosophers were saying. Their concern, Langer's concern, was with the meaning of meaning, not its existence or its verification. Symbolizing, in Langer's account of it, is not the same as thinking. Rather, it's what she called the essential act of mind, which for her encompasses more than just thinking. She saw symbolizing as a process of ideation. Symbols are elementary ideas. Symbolizing is therefore the initial conversion of sense data into elementary ideas. When we think, we then fit these ideas into more complex conceptual schemes built up gradually over time and based on perceived similarities or congruences at a logical or structural level. Evidence for this uniquely human trait can be found, she suggests, in overt action that is typical in humans but not in other animals. Actions such as speech, art, myth, or ritual. She rejected theories that sought to explain these phenomena in purely utilitarian terms as adaptive behaviors that meet some practical purpose, such as social cohesion. Rather, she saw them as examples primarily of impractical behavior, the sheer expression of ideas. The primary motive for these behaviors, in her view, is our basic urge to transform our sense experiences into symbolic form so we can understand them. Her argument rested on a logical distinction between signs and symbols, a distinction she borrowed, she said, from the Tractatus. She used these labels to denote 2 possible functions: a sound, word, mark, or other unit of some kind, natural or artificial, may function as a sign, signaling the existence, past, present, or future, or the reality of something, just as lightning signals thunder. A sign is symptomatic. Alternatively, and far more commonly in human beings, it will function as a symbol, serving to epitomize something, thunder, let's say, allowing us to think about it regardless of its existence and therefore free from any potential need to react. A symbol, according to Langer, doesn't refer to the thing that it epitomizes, rather it refers to our conception of that thing. Symbols, she said, are not proxy for their objects, but vehicles for the conception of objects. In talking about things, we have conceptions of them, not the things themselves. And it's the conceptions, not the things, that symbols directly mean, end quote. This rather idiosyncratic and perhaps more Germanic use of the word symbol has led to some confusion. Langer would later define it simply as any device whereby we are enabled to make an abstraction. A symbol for her was simply a projection in another form of the relations that hold between the various elements that make up something. Just as a Mercator map, for instance, is a projection of the relations that hold between the land masses that make up the world. A different sort of map would picture those relations in a different way. Langer further distinguished in Philosophy in a New Key between two kinds of symbolism, discursive and presentational. Broadly speaking, discursive symbolisms are vehicles for propositional thought, for thinking of a kind that can be spoken. They require us to string things together in a particular way in order to make sense. They have a certain grammar. Therefore, only thoughts that can be arranged in that way can be expressed using that kind of symbolism. Verbal language, mathematical language, and other sorts of code, including codes that use visual images, are all examples of discursive symbolisms. So far, so Wittgenstein. But according to Langer, and this is the key point, there is, as she put it, an unexplored possibility of genuine semantic beyond the limits of discursive language. The field of semantics is wider than that of language. Whereas discursive symbolisms have to operate successively, like clothes strung out on a clothesline, and are thus limited, she said, in how much complexity they can carry. Other symbolisms, such as art or myth, allow the many layers of clothing to be visible all at the same time. These non-discursive or presentational symbolisms therefore give us what she described as a simultaneous, integral presentation of meaning. Both modes are semantic, both have to do with meaning, and both speak to our intellect, but they involve different kinds of meaning and different kinds of knowledge. She rejected the positivist claim that non-discursive symbolisms, art, etc., merely manifest emotions and intuitions, and argued instead that they are signific in their own right. She was not suggesting that non-discursive symbolisms articulate knowledge of some other world. She was clear she did not believe in a supernatural world beyond this world, but she thought that in this physical space-time world of our experience, there are things which do not fit the grammatical scheme of expression. They require and have other schemes of expression. With this argument, then, she was seeking, in her words, to assimilate all mental activity to reason, to broaden our conception of mind and elevate feeling and intuition to the realm of intelligence, as opposed to, quote, grafting intelligence upon a fundamentally unintellectual organism. Although language, in her account of things, is a discursive symbolism, she regarded the use of metaphor in language as evidence of our basic power to see one thing in terms of another. Metaphor, she said, is our most striking evidence of abstractive seeing, of the power of human minds to use presentational symbols. Every new experience or new idea about things evokes, first of all, some metaphorical expression. And these metaphors then slowly fade until we no longer see them as metaphorical and imagine they are literal. This goes for non-verbal metaphors, she said, such as sacred objects or religious rites, as much as it does for verbal ones. Again, in recent years, especially since Lakoff and Johnson's work in the early 1980s, we've become very used to this notion that cognition is fundamentally metaphorical in character. But in 1942, it was a more contested idea, not least because of associations between mysticism and National Socialism. Langer's contention that there was a possibility of genuine semantic beyond the limits of discursive language made art a relevant object of philosophical inquiry. Art, in her account of it, is not a form of self-expression, nor is it a means of catharsis. She saw it instead as the expression of artistic truth, distinct in her scheme from literal or propositional truth. Literal truth, she said, is explicit, meaning it can be explicated and translated into another form. And second, it is consummated, meaning it can be negated or contradicted. Artistic truth, by contrast, is implicit and unconsummated. Therefore, it can't be divorced from the work in which it appears, and second, it harbours within its basic forms what she called a principle of development. In other words, it can't ever be fixed or conventionalised. It's inherently free and ambivalent. She acknowledged the concerns that notions of artistic truth often raise because of their association with idealism, but she argued that the untranslatability of art does not mean a work of art cannot be clear. Mysticism, she claimed, was a sign precisely of inadequacy in art, a sign of bad art. The truth value of a work of art lay for her in its adequacy, not its accuracy, vis-à-vis the ideas it embodies. Artistic truth accommodates degrees of adequacy. It's relative, not in the sense of being subjective, but in the sense of being truth to something. A good work of art for Langer is one that is more true to the forms or patterns of a given realm of feeling than a bad one is. Even in literature, she said, where the material is discursive but the form is non-discursive, the artistic import of the work, its meaning, is not the literal assertion of the words, but the way the assertion is made. Therefore, the work as a whole is the bearer of artistic import. This theory, as she pointed out, was similar in some ways to Clive Bell's notion of significant form, but she did not subscribe to what she considered the quasi-religious view that art has no meaning other than itself, art for art's sake, or self-significance. The meaning of a work of art, she said, lay in the, quote, verbally ineffable, yet not inexpressible, law of vital experience, the pattern of affective and sentient being. The specific area of knowledge that art articulates, then, is this law of vital experience, the law or morphology of human feeling, human experience, what it feels like to feel. Works of art, according to Langer, reflect in their form the patterns and rhythms present in the various ways we experience life, the different regions or realms of feeling, spatial, temporal, motive, etc. Each region, she argued, has its own logic and hence its own natural forms. What a work of art articulates is not the feeling itself, but an aspect of its logic. Although she doesn't tie specific art forms to specific regions of feeling, she does suggest that certain media lend themselves more naturally to certain regions. It is this idea that she would go on to develop in more detail in Feeling and Form. Consistent with her broader philosophy, she saw aesthetic emotion as springing then from an intellectual triumph, from overcoming what she called barriers of word-bound thought and achieving insight into literally unspeakable realities. The pleasure of art came, she said, from the comprehension of an unspoken idea. Elevating aesthetic emotion, and indeed all feeling, to the realm of knowledge had implications too for the scope of philosophy. Recognition of the semantic value of art should prompt philosophers to study the nature of art, she argued, as a serious part of epistemology. With this brief sketch of Langer's argument, I turn now to consider the aspects of philosophy in a new key that seem to interest Murdoch the most. As I mentioned, the annotations she made in her copy were extensive, and cover most chapters of the book, so it's not easy to pick out particular themes. Also, we can't tell from a simple mark or line whether she was agreeing or disagreeing with the argument. Nonetheless, viewed in conjunction with the notes she made at the back of the book, and with what she subsequently wrote in essays such as Nostalgia for the Particular and The Idea of Perfection, these markings do suggest the emergence of certain characteristic ideas starting to take hold in her mind. Of course, we also can't be certain when exactly the annotations were made, or even whether they were all made at the same time. A few of them, for instance, are in a different pencil. But the notes at the back of the book offer strong evidence, I think, that Murdoch was reading Langer's book when she was preparing her early papers on the nature of thinking and language. On the slide, and I must apologise for the poor quality of my photo, you'll see an example of Murdoch's annotations taken from the chapter on language. I'm grateful to Kingston University for allowing me to show this material, and I should just mention that permission is needed from them to reproduce it further. The underlinings you see here point to Murdoch's particular interest in what Langer had to say about metaphor, about the evidence metaphor offers for the abstractive, analogical nature of mind, about the role played by metaphor in allowing us to articulate new concepts for which we have no name, about the pervasiveness of metaphor in language and the way metaphors fade from view and come to be seen as literal propositions. The extent of these markings suggests Langer's emphasis on metaphor made a strong impression. The importance that metaphor would assume in Murdoch's philosophy is hard to overstate. Metaphor is basic, she said. How basic is itself the most basic philosophical question. Already in her 1951 paper, Thinking and Language, we see metaphor emerging as a core theme. In that paper, she described language as fundamentally metaphorical, and she argued that metaphors are illuminating precisely because thinking itself has this same analogical quality to it. These themes were given greater prominence still in her 1967 lecture, The Sovereignty of Good over Other Concepts, where she claimed that the development of consciousness was inseparably connected with metaphor, and argued that certain concepts could not be discussed without resort to metaphor, since the concepts themselves were deeply metaphorical, by which she meant that concepts like truth, love, or good are themselves approximations or abbreviations for yet more complex and inherently indeterminate sets of beliefs and ideas. Later, in Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, she would connect our use of metaphor with Wittgenstein's notion of seeing as, and contend, as Langer did, that feeling and thinking, perceiving and conceiving have the same basic metaphorical structure to them. Both are modes of comparison, and hence, for Murdoch at least, modes of evaluation. The next slide shows another example of the annotations she made in her copy of Philosophy in a New Key. This example is significant for several reasons. First, we see Murdoch highlighting Langer's claim that all mental activity, including feelings, desires, and intuitions, as well as aesthetic experience, is part of the realm of reason, the realm of intelligence. Murdoch, as we've seen, similarly rejects any sharp divide between thinking and feeling, and similarly seeks to elevate feeling, experiencing, to the realm of knowledge, in that more expansive sense of knowledge as grasping or understanding. And she similarly seeks to elevate art to this same epistemic realm. Even a significant form, she said, has to be traced. Art is cognition. Second, we see Murdoch underscoring Langer's conclusion that a broader conception of knowledge necessarily turns art into a legitimate object of philosophical inquiry. The nature of art, and especially the nature of the distinction between good and bad art, was of course absolutely central to Murdoch's inquiry and to the substance of her vision, summed up in her controversial and often misunderstood claim that art and morals have the same essence. What she meant by that claim is a topic for another day, but suffice to say that the investigation of art for Murdoch as for Langer was critical to her broader inquiry. Third, these annotations indicate the very close attention Murdoch paid to what Langer had to say about mental images, about how they operate at a deeper level, far below the level of speech, about their tendency to become purely metaphorical or purely analogical, detached from their literal or primary meaning, and about the crucial role they play in the process of abstractive thinking, all themes that Murdoch would go on to elaborate in her own philosophy. In the comment at the bottom of the page, Murdoch has written, "Role of images in thinking, contrast W." This leads me nicely on to the notes she made on the back 2 pages of her copy of Langer's book. I'm sorry the photo is a bit blurry. I'll quickly read out 1 or 2 of the notes, if I may, as they're a bit hard to decipher, and they help, I think, to illustrate Murdoch's preoccupations at this time. Thought as symbolization, but consider Ryle on polymorphous nature of thought. Words don't stand for, they do various jobs, brackets vit, and yet. Things which are full of meaning, vivid, the pansies. W's model shows this as an illusion. Occurrence of words in thought, how we are rooted in the sensible and symbolic. Metaphor, seeing things in terms of each other. Problem of the particular, we can see more than we can say, find a new approach. W attacks view that words are basically names, but in aid of view that they perform various practical functions. Question of metaphor should come in here. Why does W neglect it? W emphasizes words do things in particular contexts, 5 red apples, etc., but they are also independent. Language and new things, metaphor as primary in our struggle with the world. Those of you who are familiar with Murdoch's early essays, and indeed with her later writings in The Sovereignty of Good and Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, will recognize many of the phrases and ideas noted down here. For example, the pairing here of Ryle and Wittgenstein, the question of whether words have independent meaning, the so-called problem of the particular, the question of whether something can be full of meaning. All these were core themes in her 1952 paper, Nostalgia for the Particular, and many recurred in very similar form in the idea of perfection. Her reference here to pansies points to Wittgenstein's discussion in the Brown Book about experiences that appear to say themselves, an idea expanded in philosophical investigations. This idea sits behind the distinction Murdoch explored in Nostalgia for the Particular between crustacean experiences that keep their distinguishing shell on the outside and vertebrate experiences, Persian rug experiences, that have their structure inside them. It's a distinction that chimes in many respects with Langer's distinction between explicit and implicit, consummated and unconsummated truth. But Murdoch conceived of the boundary between these crustacean and vertebrate experiences in far less categorical terms than either Wittgenstein or Langer. It's worth noting that Murdoch would have read Philosophical Investigations by 1951, and the Brown Book too, I assume, since it was in wide circulation well before its official publication. Langer's engagement with Wittgenstein in the 1930s and early 40s, when she was composing Philosophy in a New Key, was necessarily confined to the Tractatus. But as Adrienne Dengerink-Chaplin points out, Langer's interpretation of the Tractatus, which you probably read in German, suggests a stronger continuity in Wittgenstein's work than his preface to Philosophical Investigations might imply. And many of his observations in Philosophical Investigations would, Chaplin argues, have resonated strongly with Langer. I would like to suggest that Murdoch's reading of Langer helped her too to begin to see Wittgenstein's earlier work in a more nuanced light. It's not entirely clear to me whether these notes were written before or after the Symposium on Thinking and Language, which took place in July 1951. On the one hand, many of the phrases and ideas are plainly echoed in the paper Murdoch presented at the symposium. We've talked already about the metaphorical basis of language and the role of metaphor in our attempts, as she puts it here, to capture the world anew. Moreover, the phrase rooted in the sensible, which you see here, appears almost word for word in her contribution to the symposium, where she describes our inner life as being riddled with the sensible and language as being soaked in the sensible. The whole paper was about precisely the occurrence of words in thought and whether language, by which she expressly meant verbal language, could be considered a kind of thinking, in the same way that Langer saw verbal language as the expression primarily of discursive thinking. On the other hand, the references to Ryle, the polymorphous nature of thought and the omission of fantasies, might suggest the notes were written in response to Ryle's contribution to the symposium, in which he explored the nature of polymorphous concepts and drew a distinction between histories and chronicles. Either way, the notes we see here, taken with the annotations and underlinings in the main body of the text, suggest Langer's book played a role in stimulating Murdoch's thinking. Even with the little survey I've been able to offer today, I think it's easy to see some parallels in their thinking, most notably with respect to the relevance of metaphor in our understanding of the comparative, abstractive nature of mind, with respect to the elevation of feeling into the realm of knowledge, and with respect to the need to make art, the nature of art, a central concern of philosophy. Now, in one sense, the fact that Langer and Murdoch were talking about similar things at roughly the same time is hardly surprising. These themes were dominant throughout philosophy at this time, both in analytic philosophy and in continental philosophy. But it does seem to me that Langer's account of the human animal, as well as the sheer breadth of her philosophical canvas and her willingness to combine speculation with specification, exploration with analysis, opened the door for Murdoch to begin, both methodologically and substantively, to challenge the consensus in Oxford and give voice to the dissatisfaction she was feeling with the accounts of human life on offer to her, both in Oxford and in existentialist Paris. Having identified some of the ways in which Langer's book might have inspired Murdoch, I'd like in the remaining few minutes to touch upon some fundamental differences in their work. Differences that were visible, I think, even in the 1950s, when Murdoch was just beginning to work out her philosophical position. First, I don't think Murdoch shared Langer's essentially, intrinsically limited conception of verbal language. For Murdoch, language was not a grammar-bound cage. Whereas Langer was willing to recognize a possibility of genuine semantic beyond the limits of discursive language, Murdoch saw discursive language itself as possessing an infinite, unlimited capacity to be more truthful. By truthful, she meant being faithful to, engaging intelligently and responsibly with, a reality which is beyond us. The extent to which language is truthful in this way depends on each of us as language users. Language, she said, is meaningful, ergo useful. It performs its essential task through its ability to be truthful. And its truthfulness is a function of the struggle of individuals creatively to adjust language to contingent conditions outside of it. End quote. Murdoch was quite happy to accept the view that language is, in an obvious sense, a system of differentiation or discrimination, just as Saussure had described it. But she thought its essential quality, what was highest or best about it, was its infinite capacity for truthfulness. She rejected images of a hard, rigid border dividing language from the non-linguistic world, a border we're constantly running up against. Rather, she pictured this border as a huge, wide, infinitely extensible band. Her great transformer, to use Langer's phrase, was not an electrical transformer, as it was for Langer, in which sense experiences are converted into logical form. Instead, what Murdoch visualized was a spongy, organic transformer, more like a lung. Quote, "How we see a situation is itself already a moral activity, and one which is, for better or worse, made by linguistic process. The point is, to put it picturesquely, that the transcendental barrier is a huge, wide, various band. It resembles a transformer such as the lungs, in being rather like a sponge, largely penetrable by the creative activity of individuals. While Murdoch does not intend her philosophical metaphors to be taken too literally, she saw them as tools for reflection and for what she termed image play. Her lung metaphor nonetheless implies a rather different conception of the relationship between language or thought and the outside world. A lung is contained, yes, as an electrical transformer is, but it's only semi-contained. It's cracked and porous and expandable. It involves two-way exchange. It can function better or worse. It can be more spacious or less spacious, take in more air or less. And it changes and evolves qualitatively over time. It can improve or deteriorate. Murdoch used her famous M&D example to illustrate this point. In the idea of perfection, she characterized what M was doing as something primarily verbal. M is, quote, substituting one set of normative epithets for another and learning to use more specialized normative words in preference to primary and general ones. Moral change for Murdoch was associated first and foremost with language learning, with developing what I shall call moral literacy. She argued that the meaning or conceptual frame of a moral word, indeed of any word, needs infinitely to be learned, in what she described as a deepening process, at any rate an altering and complicating process, that happens only in individual contexts and only through the occurrence of the word, either aloud or privately. In her view, only those contexts to which we choose to attend will contribute to our personal grasp of a word. Words for her, and the concepts they represent, are concrete universals, not in the lowest common denominator sense, not in the sense that they share certain common features, nor in some original genetic sense, but in an ideal endpoint sense, in the sense that they are infinitely to be learned. They reveal their unity, she said, through their excellence. And this is where literature comes in. Literature, which she defined as the art form that uses words, is important primarily because it can unlock more of the truth potential in language. It can put more of that potential into circulation. For Murdoch, the sheer gap separating good literature from bad itself implies the endless capacity of language to be more truthful, to get closer to reality and do it justice. The study of literature is, in her words, an education in how to understand human situations, not, as is often suggested, because it teaches us more about human situations, but because it teaches us more about language. It teaches us how to use language better. And learning how to use language is the primary way we come to understand things, and hence how we make moral progress. It follows that the greatest writers in her account of art are language makers, they're speech makers, discourse makers. Wittgenstein famously described Shakespeare as a Sprachschöpfer, a speech maker, distinct in his view from the prophetic Dichter. When discussing this notion, Murdoch cites George Steiner, who translates Wittgenstein's term as wordsmith. But what worried Wittgenstein about Shakespeare was not his word creation, his experimentalism in a Joycean sense. It was his discourse creation, his power to expand the limits of language, of what could be said, and hence what could be thought. Langer may have been more willing than Wittgenstein to acknowledge the role of metaphor as a catalyst for growth in language, but she still shared the essentially contained, grammar-bound view of language that made Wittgenstein so wary of Shakespeare. Murdoch's more confident, spongy view is reflected also in her discussion of the notion of ineffability. While the good, absolute perfection, is necessarily indefinable and unrepresentable, being that than which no greater can be conceived, This should not inhibit us, she said, from seeking to articulate humbler truths. This leads me finally to another important respect in which I think Murdoch's philosophical vision differed or came to differ fundamentally from Langer's. It concerns the nature of truth. Both, I think, saw truth as, in Murdoch's words, relation to separate reality. For both, truth meant truth to something, a correspondence, congruence, or adequacy of some kind at one level or another, as opposed to seeing it either as an ongoing process of unveiling or, conversely, as a given external thing. Murdoch took this relational idea of truth to be the traditional, ordinary, common sense one. Both philosophers, Langer included, also associated truth in some sense with value, in the sense at least that a good symbol, a good work of art, is one that is more true to an aspect of reality than a bad one is. There are degrees of truth, degrees of adequacy, and this means that some formulations, objectively, are better than others. But for Langer, there was no such thing as the truth. In her 1929 study, The Practice of Philosophy, she summed up her position like this: the potential ways of understanding, the forms actually contained in the world, are many, and our choice must be made according to our intellectual purposes. But we cannot formulate reality otherwise than by the pattern it actually has, from the points of reference we have chosen. Any entity which expresses such a pattern is a symbol. It is true to experience insofar as the analogy holds. But as there might be many formulations of experience, there is probably no eminently true proposition or other expression. Hence, no such thing as the truth. For Murdoch, too, there may be many formulations of expression, but this was only half the story for her. All our attempts at truth, she said, are ordered and related, triangulated, by reference to a single unattainable independent idea of perfect truth. So there are in a way two yardsticks of truth for her, a near one and a farthest off, unattainable but omnipresent one. Moreover, for Murdoch, an idea of perfect truth necessarily incorporates an idea also of perfect goodness in a moral sense. Perfection, she claimed, must in both senses, logically and morally, be thought of as absolutely good, not absolutely evil, as full, not empty, highest, not lowest. This moral dimension was not something Langer really addressed, so far as I know, certainly not in Philosophy in a New Key. It's this aspect of their respective visions that I should like to pursue further in coming months. To conclude, then, it seems clear as a matter of fact that Murdoch was reading Philosophy in a New Key around the time that she was preparing her early essays on the nature of mind. It also seems clear as a matter of interpretation that some of Langer's arguments, themselves based on ideas discussed by other philosophers with whom Murdoch was familiar, fed into Murdoch's thinking in those early essays and encouraged her to begin to identify more clearly why she too was dissatisfied with the narrow picture of mind being presented by the positivists. Langer's thesis gave Murdoch new ways of understanding those other philosophers, particularly Wittgenstein, and a new vocabulary in which to frame her own emerging position. It is no doubt a reductive exercise to try to compare two such complex thinkers, but reading Murdoch in the light of Langer helps, I think, to add a fresh perspective to Murdoch and to situate her more firmly within the intellectual landscape of her day. Thank you for being so patient with me.